The Italian general sat in a room that smelled of expensive tobacco and fresh wax, staring at a map that was as beautiful as it was useless. His uniform was pressed, his medals were polished, and his hands were perfectly clean. Outside, less than 20 miles away, the army he was supposed to lead was being dissolved into the sand. He wasn't losing because he was outnumbered. He was losing because he was waiting for the war to ask his permission before it changed. He believed that a battle was a formal arrangement, a series of polite exchanges between gentlemen. Rommel knew that a battle was a chaotic, screaming animal that had to be strangled into submission. When Rommel's staff car arrived at the command post, he didn't come to offer a salute. He came to offer a reckoning. He walked into that pristine office, looked at the general's clean hands, and realized that the greatest enemy his soldiers faced wasn't the British. It was the man sitting behind the desk. What followed was a blunt argument about how the Desert War was actually being fought. By 1941, North Africa had become the ultimate testing ground for a new kind of warfare. It was a landscape stripped of all distractions. No cities, no civilian populations to navigate, no forests to hide in. There was only the horizon, the heat, and the mechanical reliability of the machines. In this environment, every mistake was magnified, and every delay was a death sentence. The Italian army had arrived in the desert with the weight of history on its shoulders, but with equipment and a command philosophy that belonged to the previous century. They thought in terms of fortresses and static lines. They treated the desert like a trench in the Alps, believing that if they dug deep enough and stayed long enough, they could stop the tide. They built elaborate perimeters, laid thousands of mines in perfect geometric patterns, and waited for the enemy to come to them. Rommel, arriving with the Afrika Korps, looked at the same desert and saw an ocean. He understood that ground meant nothing if you couldn't control the space around it. He didn't want to hold the desert. He wanted to flow through it. He saw the Italian fortifications not as shields, but as anchors, heavy, immobile weights that would eventually drown the men attached to them. This fundamental disagreement in how to see the world was the invisible fault line that would eventually shatter the Axis alliance in the sand. The Italian general was a man of high standing, decorated in previous conflicts and respected within the halls of Rome. He was a traditionalist who believed that war was a science of logistics and slow, methodical pressure. To him, a commander's place was at the center of a web of communication, receiving reports, weighing options, and issuing formal directives. He valued order above all else. He viewed Rommel's style, leading from the front, changing plans on the fly, ignoring the chain of command, as reckless and unsoldierly. He often complained to his superiors that Rommel was playing with fire, and that his lack of a formal, static plan would lead to disaster. He believed that by maintaining a rigid defensive posture, he was showing strength and resolve. He didn't realize that in a war of movement, rigidity is just another word for a target. He spent his days perfecting his defensive perimeter, unaware that Rommel's tanks were already practicing how to drive right around it. The crisis began not with a roar, but with a series of silences. One by one, the Italian outposts stopped reporting. It wasn't that they were being overrun in massive firefights. They were being isolated. Rommel had identified the seams between the Italian units and driven his panzers through them in the middle of the night. He wasn't interested in capturing the outposts. He was interested in making them irrelevant. The Italian general reacted by the book. He sent out scouts to verify the reports. He waited for confirmation from his superiors in Tripoli and Rome. He refused to move his reserve units until he had a complete picture of the enemy's location. He sat in his office, surrounded by telephones that were increasingly silent, waiting for the world to make sense again. But in the desert, by the time you have a complete picture, the picture has already changed. While the general waited for certainty, his army was being carved into pieces. Supply trucks were captured because they were following approved routes that were now behind German lines. Artillery batteries were silenced before they could fire a shot because they were waiting for authorization to change their targets. The fortress the general had built was becoming a prison. Rommel, sensing the paralysis, didn't wait for the Italians to reorganize. He drove straight for the heart of the command. Before we witnessed the moment Rommel walked into the command tent, if you value these deep dives into the psychological turning points of history, consider subscribing to History Beyond Battle. We explore the friction between commanders, the moments where clashing personalities decided the fate of thousands. Join us as we go beyond the maps to find the human truth of the front lines. Rommel arrived at the Italian headquarters in a cloud of dust, his goggles pushed up onto his cap, his uniform covered in the grit of the front line. He didn't wait to be announced. He walked past the sentries, who were too stunned by his appearance to stop him, and into the room where the Italian general sat. The room was cool, quiet, and smelled of cigarette smoke and paper. It was the office of a man who thought he was in control. The general began to offer a formal greeting, perhaps even a complaint about Rommel's lack of coordination. He started to point to his maps, showing where his lines were supposed to be. Rommel didn't even look at the table. He walked to the window, looked out at the empty horizon, and then turned back to the man behind the desk. He saw the general's clean hands, his undusted boots, and his calm expression, and the contrast with the chaos outside was more than he could stand. Rommel interrupted the general's explanation of his defensive strategy. He didn't raise his voice, but the edge in it was sharper than any shout. He told the general that his lines didn't exist, that his outposts were already flying white flags, that while the general was waiting for confirmation, his soldiers were waiting for a leader who wasn't afraid of the dark. The Italian general stiffened, invoking his rank and the orders from Rome. Rommel stepped toward him, leaning over the map table, and said the words that would define the failure. He said, "You're waiting for the battle to become what you want it to be. I'm fighting the battle as it is." He told the general that a map is just paper, but a soldier's life is time, and that by wasting time waiting for the perfect moment to act, the general had already surrendered the only thing that mattered. Rommel argued that hesitation in the desert could be just as dangerous as defeat. He told him to get out of the chair, get into a car, and see the wreckage he had created by staying still. The room went deathly quiet. The Italian staff officers looked at the floor, unable to meet Rommel's gaze. The general looked at his hands, which were clean and dry, while Rommel's were stained with oil and sand. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The general wasn't being careful. He was being irrelevant. He was a ghost in a machine that had already moved on. Rommel didn't wait for a response. Rommel made it clear that the situation demanded immediate action, that the units remaining would be folded into the German command. He gave the general a choice. He could stay in his quiet room and wait for the British to arrive and capture him, or he could leave now and never return to a field of command again. He made it clear that he would rather have an empty chair than a man who used his rank as a shield against reality. Within days, the situation forced a reorganization of the sector's command. He returned to Italy, a man broken not by the enemy, but by the realization that his entire understanding of war had been obsolete. He had spent his life learning how to manage a battlefield that no longer existed. The remaining units were reorganized as Axis forces tried to stabilize the front. Rommel didn't hold a grudge against the Italian soldiers. He knew they were brave. He knew they could fight. He simply knew they had been led by a man who loved the process of war more than the reality of it. He proved that a soldier is only as good as the clarity of the man giving the orders. The story of Rommel and the Italian general is more than a footnote of the North African campaign. It is a lesson in the danger of the static mind. Rommel understood that in any high-stakes environment, the greatest risk is not making a mistake. It is doing nothing while you wait for certainty. He believed that a commander's first duty is to the truth of the moment, not the comfort of the plan. He proved that rank and tradition mean nothing if they are used as a shield against reality. In the end, Rommel's legacy isn't just about tanks and tactics. It's about the courage to see the world as it is and the speed to act before the world moves on without you. Because in the desert and in life, the only thing that stays still is the dead. Follow us for more stories from the front lines of history.